Hey, Mary, are you going to play for us this morning?
I'm ready.
All right, welcome everybody. Mary. Our invocation this morning is Cliff Thomas. Cliff, are you ready for the prayer?
Is your prayer person here?
He is. I saw him a minute ago. Let's see. Since he maybe stepped away, Bob, would you like to step up and do that for us?
Be happy to, John.
Thank you.
Pray with me. Lord, love you so much. Thank you for this day that you've given us the opportunity just to wake up this morning. Be with our leader, Miss Jonna. Ask that you continue to watch over her. We ask, Lord, that you just heal her, help her to be better, to do better. Thank you, Lord, for just seeing her shining face here this morning. Thank you for all of my buds here, the ones that's on this Zoom this morning. Lord, I ask that you bless each and every one of these guys and gals. I ask that you be with them today. Help us to go out into our world and make a difference in someone's life. Sure love you. Thank you, Lord, for what you do in advance. We ask these things in your precious name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bob.
Yes, ma'am.
Our flag salute and four-way test is Jennifer Jenkins.
Please join me for the flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. In the four-way test of the things we think, say, or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Inquiring minds want to know.
Thank you. Okay. I didn't know that I saw any guests today other than our guest speaker. And so we'll move right into happy dollars. Do we have any happy dollars? I have 5 happy dollars for being out of hospital and getting better. So I'll start things off there.
Man.
I probably should give 5 happy dollars. I went down and surprised my daughter for her 21st birthday. This is Virginia, this past weekend. And a group of her friends and I went and took her out to eat. And I spent the weekend with her. And toward the end of the weekend, she's in Denton, Texas at University of North Texas in her 3rd year. She told me that her and her fiance, Eli, who is in the Navy, they've been engaged 2 years, have set a wedding date for next August 12th. And so that's pretty exciting, the whole weekend. So I'll have to get $5 to Linda.
Congratulations. Do we have any other happy dollars?
I have a happy dollar.
Okay.
And my happy dollar is because you are back with us, Jonna. And so it's seeing your smiling face this morning and having you lead the meeting. Just really excited to have you back with us.
Thank you. And thank you for all you've done in my absence.
Of course.
Anybody else? All right, Holly, why don't we go with April birthdays then?
All right. Mary, will you be able to play for us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. All right. Our first birthday is April Heupel. And then James Russell, Cliff Thomas,
Mhm.
Louis Beckett, and Virginia Sanders. All right. So
Everybody have
everybody,
their mics off. Here we go.
okay. Happy birthday. Right. Happy birthday, April Rotarians. Little bowl. This is for the $25 Hal Smith gift certificate. So let's see who I pull out. Virginia Sanders. Virginia, happy birthday.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited.
And now for the other, for the $100 one, and it is Hayden Welch is not here. Oh, tell Hayden what he missed. Okay. Kelly, is Kelly here?
Kelly Nemechek? Yeah, he was.
All right. Well, Kelly is our recipient. And to all of you April birthdays, happy birthday, because we've got a couple of them coming up, 3 of them coming up this week. So John, 17th. So happy birthday, and
Thanks, Polly. Thank you.
you're welcome.
That's right. Thank you.
Have a great day. Okay, we're done. Okay.
All right, well, next, we are going to induct our newest member to Sooner Rotary, Miss Kim Sutton. So usually we do this in person and we would present with you with a Sooner Rotary pin, but let me get, it's going to be a very brief induction. If you would raise your right hand and say, let me stop share for just a second. Say, I, and state your name,
Kimberly Sutton,
and choose to join Sooner Rotary today.
joined Sooner Rotary today.
I pledge to devote my time, my talent, and my resources to the club and community service projects of Sooner Rotary.
I pledge to devote my time, resources. Sorry, I forgot what.
Oh, and talent to the
And
club
talents.
community service projects.
To the club and the community service projects.
I pledge to live my personal and professional life by the 4-way test.
I pledge to live my professional and personal life by the 4-way test.
And most of all, I pledge to have fun as a member of this organization.
And most of all, I pledge to have fun as a member of this organization.
Awesome. Welcome. We're very happy to have you.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Be a member.
Next, we want to recognize Susan Whiteneck. She has received her Paul Harris +3. Thank you very much for your contribution to the world and saving babies' lives and sick women and doing a lot. So my husband always calls me during Rotary. Just a moment. I'm during Rotary, babe. I'll call you back.
I'm sorry.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Every week. Okay. Don't forget the community-wide service project coming up April 24th. Need volunteers. And as a board, when we met last week, skip 1 screen. We decided that we are going to start meeting again in person starting in May. And so as our speakers are allowed, we we may still have some speakers who prefer to have an occasional virtual meeting, but starting in May, we're going to go ahead and start meeting at the trails. And Jane, did we want to talk to them about their breakfast? It's a little bit different.
Sure. So the breakfast is going to be still a buffet, but the trail staff will have to serve it to us due to the health restrictions that are still in place for right now. And but because that's going to require more staff, it's a little bit more expensive. So one way that we've kept the cost at the regular price that we've paid since we moved there is to eliminate the fresh fruit, which is apparently really expensive. And so bring your own fruit, but it will still be the eggs and the breakfast meat and potatoes and coffee and that type of thing. So, yeah, so we're really excited to do that and looking forward to being back in that space and, enjoying that breakfast and fellowship with all of you. Are there any questions?
Awesome. Thank you, Jane. Jennifer, you had an announcement.
Yes. So next week, everybody is going to want to make sure that you come to the meeting. We are going to have a fellowship meeting, and we're going to go into our breakout rooms again, like we did the last fellowship meeting. But this time, Katie and I have really cooked up something fun and challenging. And the team that wins the challenge, every team member is going to get a $50 gift card to either Housesmith Restaurants or DoorDash. So make sure you don't miss it. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. Do we have other announcements? Okay, next week should be a lot of fun. So that I can't imagine what Katie and Jennifer have come up with. We're going to move on now to our program. Michael, did you want to introduce our guest this morning?
I would be happy to. Dr. Hill's presentation is actually going to be moderated by our own Dick Pryor. I know Dr. Hill from having served with him on the Norman Transcript editorial board. Dr. Carlos Hill is the chair of the Clara Luper African and African American Studies program. He's an associate professor at OU. He's the author of 3 books. Beyond the Rope, The Impact of Lynching on Black Culture and Memory. Second book is The Murder of Emmett Till, A Graphic History. And the third book, which is the topic that he's going to talk about, is the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, The Photographic History. I always say that teaching is the most important profession, the most respectable profession. I think Dr. Hill's research and his teaching on this topic are important, not just to Oklahomans, but also to the nation. So I'd like for you to welcome, please, Dr. Carlos Hill and our own Dick Pryor.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Michael and Dr. Hill. It's a real privilege for us to have you with us this morning. As many people may know, hopefully everyone knows, May 31st and June 1st will be the 100-year marker for the Tulsa Race Massacre that occurred in 1921. And Michael referenced your latest book, which I have here. I want to hold it up so everyone can see it. I highly recommend it. My friend Randy Crable from the Tulsa World has also written a book that I highly recommend. But this one in particular, and I want to ask you about it, Dr. Hill, this one in particular, because of the photographs in it, is especially important, I think. Randy's uses newspaper articles from the era, from the time when that happened, this event happened. But your book, Dr. Hill, provides pictures and accounts of what happened that I think really bring this particular tragic, horrific event to life. What prompted you to take this approach, to do this book? I know the anniversary did, but tell us a little bit about how this book came together, if you would, please.
Yeah, so thank you again for having me. It's wonderful to be in conversation with you today. The book is a product of, two things. One, I've spent my whole career studying the history of lynching and racial violence. It's something that I, take a lot of pride in, also responsibility, because it is a history that for many Americans, they are unaware of. And so there's for me, a great responsibility in trying to tell that story as accurately as possible and help people understand the ways in which that history is still with us. And we still need to do a lot to reconcile ourselves to that history. But, and so me working on the race massacre, writing about the race massacre comes from a larger kind of commitment to telling the stories of, lynching and racial violence in America, as well as in Oklahoma. And so I came to Oklahoma in 2016, in August of 2016. And I came here to join the great Black Studies department that we have. And, upon arrival, one of the things that I began to realize is, or what became very clear is that, the people that I came in contact with at OU thought that I should know something about, talk about the race massacre. And so, just imagine the first few months of me at OU, conversations with colleagues that start, do you know anything about the race massacre? Have you studied the race massacre? And of course I had, but I didn't really understand the significance to the state's history. I didn't understand how it continues to be such a lively topic of discussion. And so over those first few months of being in Oklahoma, talking to colleagues, talking to people in the community, it became really clear that this history is alive and well in this state. And so I just began to do what I do, begin to talk to people who are directly connected to this history and try to figure out how I could be of service. And out of that came the Teacher Institute that, we've done for the last 4 years, but also this book, Pictorial History or Photographic History of the Race Massacre. And part of what I wanted to do in this book and what was on my heart is I really felt a need to tell the story from the vantage point of victims, survivors, and their descendants. Because for 100 years, their perspectives have been, I would say, omitted and to a certain degree, just ignored. And so it became very important for me to try to write a book that would center their stories. And so one of the things that I discovered in my 2016, 2017 is just the number of photographs that there are connected to the massacre. And if you talk to Scott Ellsworth, who I would consider a friend, but also someone who's been studying this for more than 40 years, he can tell you in the 1960s and 70s, there were virtually no photographs that were available vis-a-vis archives or just people willing to share their private collections. And so it struck me that there were so many photographs of what occurred, but no photographic history. And certainly it hasn't been a book that's tried to tell the story, exclusively from the vantage point of victims and survivors. And so in that, I found a book and working with my editor at OU Press. But I think the book is really about trying to help people to draw closer, to draw nearer to what actually happened. The book is, the title of the book is The 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. massacre is not a word that we use a lot to talk about American history or American politics. And so what was very important for me to try to bring home, what is it that we're talking about, that survivors are talking about when they talk about this as a massacre? What does it mean for a 35-block area to be destroyed? Try to do my best to bring that to life, as you mentioned, through the photographs, right? What does a 35-block area destroyed look like? What does a race massacre look like? What does it even feel like? I think the photographs help to convey that to a certain degree. And so that's why we wanted to pair photographs and survivor accounts together.
And it certainly works. And it's certainly an important view into what actually happened, because for a lot of us growing up in Oklahoma, we never heard about the Tulsa Race Massacre. I looked back recently at my Harlow's Oklahoma history book, thinking that there would be something in there about this event. Thumbing through it, there was not one single mention. This is in the Oklahoma history that we were taught growing up in Oklahoma. And there was not one mention of anything that happened in Tulsa in 1921. So we have a lot of catching up to do.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you to give us a brief synopsis. And in your introduction in the book, you brilliantly write a description of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have time to get into much depth because we've got a lot of questions, and I want to leave time for our members to ask you questions as well. But I want to set it up this way. In the very first part of the introduction, you talk about the Greenwood district in North Tulsa, just across the tracks, north of downtown Tulsa. 1/10 of Tulsa's overall population lived there, spanned 35 blocks. And it included, this area did, 200 businesses, including 31 restaurants, more than 24 grocery stores. There is not a grocery store in North Tulsa now. But at that time, more than 24 grocery stores, 5 hotels, 4 drugstores, 2 theaters, 12 churches, as well as 2 schools, 2 hospitals, 2 newspapers, and a public library. This was a vibrant community, a successful community. And yet, in late May 1921, it was destroyed. What happened? And more specifically, what inspired, if that's the correct word, and it may not be, but what inspired the people in Tulsa and people that came to Tulsa who were working there to do what they called put down a Negro uprising, when in reality it was, as you have stated, and accurately so, was really a military action against the African-American population in Tulsa, and it was a massacre.
Yeah. I would say that, what provoked, what the immediate provocation for the race massacre was an allegation of sexual assault. So a teenager or a young Black man, Dick Rowland, is accused of assaulting Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white girl. And we don't know quite what happened when Dick Rowland and Sarah Page interacted in a elevator in the Drexel Hotel on May 30th. But all we know is that she screamed after a brief encounter with Dick Rowland. She fled the elevator. Dick Rowland fled the elevator in the opposite direction. And, Sarah Page, we don't know what she tells the police, but there's no written record. We don't know what she told the shop keeper or the merchant who she came in contact immediately thereafter. All we know is that, on May 31st, the Tulsa Tribune publishes, an incendiary article, essentially insinuating that Dick Rowland had sexually assaulted Sarah Page. We also believe, although we have not been able to find the long lost editorial, Scott Ellsworth, as well as others, have spent many years trying to find it. But we believe that there was a really inflammatory editorial to lynch a Negro tonight that was published in the Tribune hours following their first article insinuating that Dick Rowland had in fact assaulted Sarah Page, and that there was talk of lynching. And so those two editorials that Randy Crable documents in his book, those were the two provocations, I would say, for what occurred. Because what it did was it really inflamed whites, against not just Dick Rowland, but the Greenwood community. And so you have a situation where, there is an allegation of sexual assault. And this was the most, explosive of allegations given the time, right? There were nearly 5,000 lynchings in our country, and 20% of those lynchings occurred because of an allegation of rape. So this is one of the most explosive allegations, particularly an allegation connected to a Black man and a white woman. And so this is what really sets in motion the race massacre. But ultimately, and this is what I try to document in the book, ultimately, the city of Tulsa, particularly the Tulsa Sheriff Department, Police Department, bear responsibility for the escalation of what occurred. Because when African American men who are worried that Dick Rowland will be lynched come downtown to offer assistance, they are turned back, and in coming downtown to offer assistance, they ultimately find themselves in a situation where they have to defend themselves from attack. And so, the police could have done much more at the time. They could have done much more to sort of, to tamp down the talk of lynching, to disperse the crowd that had been gathering around the courthouse, because Dick Rowland was being held. He was arrested after the Tulsa, or slightly before the Tulsa Tribune story. And so there was a lot that could have been done, but instead of de-escalation, what occurred was escalation. And the city of Tulsa deputizes, nearly 500 white citizens to put down, quote unquote, a Negro rebellion, as you mentioned. And this is where the events really spiral out of control. And the deadliest, the worst race massacre in American history occurs because of the ways in which, in the moments, in the evening hours of May 31st, the city essentially, empowers white citizens to attack Greenwood. And so, the result of that is a 35 block area destroyed, and we believe nearly 300 individuals killed as a result of it.
And there's an extensive photographic history that you drew on. Thankfully, there were photographs that were found, but it strikes me that there were so many photographs because at that time, photographs of the kind of violence that was inflicted upon people in Tulsa in 1921 were prized. They were valued. Tell us about that. Tell us about why there were these photographs that people collected, kept, shared, and even used as postcards.
Yeah, this is a much longer discussion, but I would just say that we have to imagine a world that in which there is no social media, there is no television, there is no radio, right? And so the way in which individuals connect with and can be a part of events and capture their presence at events is going to be through photography. And so photography, was, I wouldn't say it was in its infancy, but sort of the, the kind of quick flash photography where, that allowed the average citizen to take photographs and to get them developed. This was a relatively new technology. And so what we have to understand is that at this time, lynchings were a kind of form of popular entertainment, and lynching photographs in that, with respect to this culture, as you had mentioned, became kind of prized souvenirs. These photographs became ways of, one, showing one's solidarity with the mob, but also capturing, documenting one's place in the violence, or in the, with respect to Tulsa, with respect to this quote unquote Negro rebellion. And so these photographs were seen, were not something that people were ashamed of. These photographs helped them to articulate to friends and family the role that they played in the violence. And so for historians like myself, these photographs become a way to do two things. One, it kind of helps us to understand lynching culture and the ways in which, participating in the violence was seen as honorable behavior, and particularly honorable masculine behavior, right? Because whites, Tulsans could say, we stood up for Sarah Page. We put down this rebellion, right? We successfully repressed this rebellion. And that was a kind of point of pride. And there were, numerous, hundreds of photographs, but at least 24 postcards that we discovered, and kind of carefully sifting through the photographs that were sold by photograph studios or just private citizens. And so, when we think about lynching culture, we have to think about a time in which the kind of media that we have doesn't exist. And we have to think about a time in which, photograph becomes the primary way by which whites who live during this era of lynching document and show their solidarity with sort of, the white mob. And so it's a very tragic, it's a very sad history, it's a very disturbing history, but unfortunately it is our history. And so we tried to bring that to bear, or I tried to bring that to bear in the book.
I want to move to other questions. And if anyone has a question, please raise your hand and let us know, and I'll call on you, or just jump in if you will. But I have one other question about the event itself, the race massacre itself, and you address it in the book. And this is another aspect of this that is not talked about. And that is what happened to the survivors, to the refugees from the Greenwood district, from North Tulsa, immediately afterward. There were many people killed, but there were many more that survived. What happened to them? Where did they go? And how were they attended to?
I mean, the race massacre is talked about as the deadliest episode of anti-Black violence in American history. Some have referred to it as the largest civil disturbance since the Civil War. And that resonates with me because in the aftermath of slavery, just imagine 4.5 million people across the South who are now free, quote unquote free, and they have very little means to care for themselves because they've been systematically denied the ability to do so. And so, the end of slavery represented just an enormous humanitarian crisis. In the same way that the destruction of a 35 block area where every home, every business, every school, every hospital is either burned to the ground or significantly destroyed, or excuse me, significantly harmed. And so when you think about how a community, just within 24 hours is laid to waste, and there's literally nowhere to get food, there's really nowhere to even lay one's head, you begin to understand how desperate survivors were. And so fortunately for them, the Tulsa-based American Red Cross provided that emergency assistance. And so the photographs in the book really help us to understand, the ways in which the Red Cross had to provide tents, army tents, that were sturdy enough to allow, to give, race massacre survivors some shelter. Ultimately, they built temporary, more sturdier temporary structures. But in the weeks following, essentially a community the size of, 10,000 people, 11,000 people were rendered homeless. And so those individuals had to find a way to survive. Some people were able to get army tents from the American Red Cross. Some were able to stay with white employers. Some moved away temporarily to Oklahoma City or to an all-Black town until they could get the money to rebuild. But just imagine a situation of chaos, a situation of scarcity, and in the midst of all of that, survivors not only trying to find a way to provide shelter, food for themselves, but try to find loved ones that they were disconnected with because of the chaos. And so a lot of what occurs is a searching for family and loved ones. And that search, I would say, goes on today. There's still descendants who are searching for family members who were killed, right? And part of the discussion about mass graves is for those individuals to try to finally put to rest what happened to a relative who went missing during the race massacre. And so just imagine general just chaos and individuals doing the best that they can to find food, to find shelter, to find loved ones. And this process again goes on today.
And I want to say one other thing about that. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to do a program with Dr. Clyde Snow, world-renowned forensic anthropologist from Norman. And we talked about his work that he did about 20 years ago on what was then called the Tulsa Race Riot Commission. And he said that he was convinced that there were many Black people that were buried in various places. Their bodies were disposed of in various ways, including put on railroad cars, in part because the Black funeral home in the district was burned down and was unavailable to care for Black bodies. I think that gives you an indication of the depth of this on a personal level as well as your book. We have a question from Susan who wants to know, where are your books available?
They are available from, so my first book, Beyond the Rope, is available vis-a-vis the Cambridge University Press website. You can also find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. And the same for the Emmett Till book. It's available on the Oxford University Press website for purchase, but also Amazon, Barnes & Noble. For the Race Massacre book, I'm very happy that, this was published through the University of Oklahoma Press. The book is widely available in bookstores in Tulsa, Oklahoma City, as well as, on the University of Oklahoma Press website, Amazon, as well as Barnes & Noble. So, and if people would like to buy directly from the distributor, I could provide that information in the chat or in an email follow up.
Thank you. If anyone else has a question, perhaps the chat would be a good way to communicate that, and then we'll take it from there. Jane asks, I'm curious if there were similar violent attacks in other places in the U.S. at that time.
There were similar attacks in Oklahoma in the lead up to 1921. I talk about, and I'm still, I should say, learning about this history. But in Dewey, Oklahoma in 1918, a similar episode of anti-Black violence where the town's white community attacks the Black district or the Black area of Dewey, Oklahoma, driving roughly 20 families out of the town. Ultimately, Black people come back to Dewey, but in 1918, there was a similar attack and expelling of Black people from Dewey, Oklahoma. There were at least 5 other, besides Dewey, 5 other attacks on Black communities that occurred in Oklahoma, beginning in 1901 all the way through to 1918. And so this is what happened in Tulsa. We have to understand in 1921 is not exceptional within the context of American history or Oklahoma history, but the scale of what occurred in Tulsa is, I think, unprecedented. And so what we have to understand is that lynchings occurred in Oklahoma. There's nearly 80 documented lynchings from statehood to 1950. There is at least a half dozen attacks on Black communities, of which Tulsa is one of them, that occurred beginning in 1901 all the way to 1921. And so racial violence in Oklahoma was common. However, the race massacre in terms of its scope and scale, unprecedented in Oklahoma history and American history. And so when we think about this history, we have to do a better job of not making the race massacre this kind of exceptional event. And I have to do a better job. We have to do a better job of contextualizing it and helping people to understand that this is a part of a much larger story.
Jana asked a question about the impact of this being characterized as a race massacre as opposed to a race riot.
Yeah.
You address that in the introduction to your book.
Yes.
Why did that shift, and why is massacre a more appropriate way to describe what happened in 1921?
Yes. When I began my work with the Centennial Commission in 2017, the commission was talking about what occurred as a race riot, because historically that's how it had been understood. But even with that, underneath that were other perspectives that had long been suppressed, ignored, disregarded. And, beginning, in the days following the race massacre, survivors are talking about what occurred as a disaster. They're talking about what occurred as a massacre. They are talking about it in ways that they hope to convey the enormity of their loss. And, ultimately, Tulsa newspapers, the Tulsa community sort of rallied around talking about it as a riot. And that in many ways served the interests of insurance companies, the city, insulating them from having to necessarily pay restitution or damages. And, so for 100 years, this perspective of a race riot, Negro rebellion, has kind of held sway. And so part of the work, my work on the commission, has been to try to center the telling of this history from the vantage point of survivors and victim survivors and descendants. And for me, chief among that is talking about it as a massacre. Historically, I think there's tremendous evidence that what occurred was a massacre. And when I say massacre, I don't just mean the loss of life, or which there was plenty of that. I don't just mean the destruction of the, a 35 block area. What I'm talking about when I refer to the events as a massacre, is the kind of willful, deliberate, military style assault on the community that culminated in the destruction of every significant structure in the community, as well as the loss of life. And so it's that coordinated, systematic assault on the community, aided and abetted by the city of Tulsa, police department, the local unit of the National Guard. That when I talk about it as a massacre, I'm really trying to lift up, how victims and survivors have understood it, as well as the complicity of the city in the destruction of Black Wall Street or the Greenwood District. And so for me, that is why it's so important to talk about it as a massacre. And just, to add to this, I'm someone who really believes that reparations and restitution are owed victim survivors and their descendants. And so the photographs in this book are meant to try to compel our conscience, to try to prick our conscience and to force us to bear witness to this history. And if those photographs are moving, if the stories of survivors are moving, my hope is that it moves us in the direction of justice for race massacre victim survivors and descendants.
And insurance companies at the time and others provided reparations. The laws allowed that for white people, but not for Black people who were actually the victims of this massacre. I'd like to ask anyone that has a question to send it to me in the chat or speak up now. We'd love to hear from you. I'm not hearing any questions. I only have about 20, 30 more, but we have to get finished here at 8 o'clock. But I do want to ask you about education. And you've been working since coming to Oklahoma. You've been working on helping the state of Oklahoma develop a curriculum so that students of today can learn about the events of this disaster, this massacre in Tulsa of 1921. What is the curriculum now, as opposed to the curriculum that I mentioned earlier, back when many of us were going to school, where this was not even mentioned?
Yeah. So I would just start by saying the state and its education system has done a tremendous amount of damage by not teaching this history of what occurred. And, there is real resentment. I've experienced it in talking about what occurred as a race riot, or talking about it as anything but a race riot. There's a deep-seated resistance to that because of the miseducation or lack of education about what occurred. And so that is a form of, damage that has been done by not educating the citizens of Oklahoma about this history. And so 100 years later, we are still trying to figure out the best way to educate the state's population about what occurred. And so beginning in 2018, with working on behalf of the commission, we created a teacher institute. And the institute has been about taking the curriculum that already exists and the curriculums that teachers have created and have been implementing in their classrooms, over the last several years, but really, giving teachers the tools and the confidence to teach this history at a really high level and in ways that engage a diverse classroom. And so, our teacher institutes aren't as much about creating curriculum, because there certainly are curriculum that are available to teachers. The question isn't so much about curriculum, it's about empowering teachers to want to teach the history, be inspired to teach the history, to care about the history, and in caring about the history, teach their students to care about the history, and not just the history, the people connected to that history, the people impacted by that history. And so the Institute, we've had 4 to date, or 3 to date. We're actually, right now, there is a Oklahoma Educator Institute that began March 25th that'll run through the centennial. On Thursday, we'll have our 4th or 5th session. It's a 3-hour long session in the evenings on Thursdays for Oklahoma educators. And it's about inspiring them to giving them confidence and tools and resources to teach this history at a high level, and try to undo some of the damage that has been done by not teaching this history for nearly 100 years.
We have maybe 2 minutes left. Jonna, with your consent, I'd like to let Michael ask a question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
Okay, Dr. Hill, I grew up in Tulsa, and I've told you that I found out about the race massacre when I was with a friend, and we were driving by a cemetery in North Tulsa near where he lived. And he pointed to an open area in the cemetery and said, there's a mass grave right there. And he told me the story that he had heard from his grandmother, who was a survivor. And I feel cheated that I was not taught about this at any time during my education. I feel hurt. I feel like I've been deceived. So there's a saying that the victor writes the history. And I feel like that there's been a cover up, that history's been rewritten and suppressed. I just, very quickly, can you respond to that?
Absolutely. There are a lot of things that we could point to in the suppression of the history of the race massacre. We could point to the ways in which the now infamous "To Lynch a Negro" editorial has gone missing from the records. We could talk about the mass graves and how Black bodies were dumped in the Arkansas River, or in mass graves in cemeteries across Tulsa. But the chief form of suppression with the race massacre was the state of Oklahoma, the city of Tulsa, not conducting a thorough investigation into what occurred. That was, for me, the beginning of the suppression of this history, because what it allowed for is the grand jury report to blame what occurred on the Black men who came downtown to defend Dick Rowland. And in blaming them for what occurred, it sort of freed up the city from responsibility and culpability. And this, this idea of a Negro rebellion held sway for nearly 80 years, until the first commission produced the first definitive investigation into what occurred. And so the lack of a thoroughgoing investigation in the days following is where the suppression truly begins. Aspects of the suppression, the mass graves, the destruction of documentary evidence to show white complicity, the city's complicity. That all stems from that original sin of not actually investigating. And so you are right to feel cheated, to feel betrayed, but the intent in suppressing this history was to insulate the city, to insulate even the state from having to really provide restitution and support in rebuilding the community.
I want to close by mentioning that each Monday in May at 1 o'clock on KGOU, we're going to have the KGOU Book Club with an author each week discussing a book about Tulsa's Greenwood District and the Tulsa Race Massacre. And on May 24th, put it down on your calendar, May 24th at 1 o'clock, we will be talking to Dr. Carlos Hill about his book, an outstanding book. And I want to hold it up again so you can see it and look for it. 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, a photographic history. Dr. Carlos Hill, thank you very much for joining us at Sooner Rotary today.
It's an honor. It's a privilege. I thank you for your time. Thank you for bearing witness. There's going to be a lot of things that educational events connected to the centennial. And so I hope to see you at some of those.
Thank you very much. Jonna?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Hill, and thank you, Dick, for moderating. This was very interesting and educational. So I'd like to say thank you, everybody, for being here today, and welcome, Kimberly, and go out and have a great week and open the opportunities.
Welcome home, Jonna.
Thank you.
God bless you, Jana.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jonna.